Hello, greetings. My name is Luigi Cristiano, and welcome to another lecture from 2020 Honors Chemistry, short lecture series. Today, my presentation will be about the pollution of microplastics. I will also explain the presence of microplastics in our society and why it is so important to keep studying the future effects it can have on us and the environment. Not too many people know that 74,000 to 121,000 particles of microplastics are consumed through inhalation and ingestion by humans every year. I hope my presentation will bring you awareness of the pollution of microplastics so we can solve this problem in our society together today. I hope you guys enjoy. Today, in my presentation, I will be reflecting on the very inspirational C&EN article. This article was the basis of my presentation, which led me to research and find out what a microplastic is, where they come from, and where can you find them, how harmful they can be, comparing the different types of plastic, and the current instruments used to help the field with research. And my presentation will be finalized in the conclusion. In the C&EN article, the pervasiveness of microplastics, there has been no evidence currently of people being harmed while they consume microplastics. But there's no evidence that it doesn't harm you. This field of microplastics is very new, and the funding for the research has begun. A study by Philip Schwabel from 2018 confirms that sea life and wildlife are consuming microplastics on the daily, and humans are as well. They have found that microplastics are also flying through the air, which has been currently and recently affecting crop growth on farms. In 1 kilogram, there can be up to 40,000 microplastic particles. Richard C. Thompson, a professor of marine biology, once said, "Nano and microplastics in seafood could easily be eaten by humans. There is no reason to doubt this is happening." Following up on this quote by Thompson, a study on a shellfish species found on many restaurant menus confirmed that it accumulated billions of nanoplastic and microplastic particles. This was the first study of its kind. Microplastics are small plastic particles that are less than 0.2 inches long, and this is according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In reality, a microplastic is just a small piece of plastic that has been broken down because of erosion or water or weather that has become just a smaller piece of plastic. To visualize the size of a microplastic, the sesame seeds on our burger bun are actually just about the same exact size as a microplastic in the ocean or that we eat or consume as humans. In the pictures on the screen, the picture on the left with a finger with holding microplastics is comparing them to the size of sesame seeds. As you can see, they're just about the same size. In 2014 alone, there was about 51 trillion pieces of microplastics in the ocean. This quantity outnumbers the stars in the Milky Way by about 500 times. The reason there's so many pieces of microplastics in the water is because of their minuscule size, and they're harder to locate and take out. Volunteers can easily go and pick up big pieces of plastic on beach cleanups, but it is much harder to spot and pick up microplastics in moving water. An important question to ask is, where do microplastics actually originate from? Well, microplastics actually come from macroplastics. To further understand what a microplastic is, we must also know what a macroplastic is. Macroplastics are much larger objects like plastic bottles, hair combs, and toothbrushes. Both of these types of plastics roam throughout the ocean, but there are many more pieces of microplastics because of their smaller size. They break off of macroplastics because of things like the sun, wind, or other causes. They then break off of the macroplastic and into the ocean, or start flying around in the atmosphere. This is where they either fall into the ocean or fall on crops on farms. Another problem associated with microplastics are resin pellets. Resin pellets are pre-production plastic parts. They are about the size of a bead, and they are pre-production plastic parts. They are used to eventually make items like a plastic bag, bottle, or toy. The problem with these pellets that there are accidents, such as the accident of Hong Kong in 2012, when a typhoon caused 150 tons of pellets to be lost at sea. The pellets were later washed up on shore, on the beaches. It took them weeks to try and recover all these pellets, but only 70% of them were found. This leaves the other 30% in the ocean, roaming around, where the sea life can mistake them for food and cause negative effects on sea life. And the last main source of microplastics in the environment is synthetic clothing. Synthetic clothing is not an obvious source, but it is still one of the main sources of microplastics today in our environment. Believe it or not, polyester, nylon, acrylic, and other synthetic fibers are all actually forms of plastic. According to a study done in 2016, all these plastic fibers are actually shedding from our clothing, even when we're just walking around. This just adds to the pollution already in our environment. Another question that comes up is, where exactly are the microplastics in our environment? The obvious answer to the question is the ocean because of its excessive pollution and the fish and sea animals in the ocean. Surprisingly, there's also a large amount of microplastics in our water system today. In the US alone, 94% of the tap water contains microplastics. What is even more concerning is that even by buying plastic bottled water, you are not escaping the effects of microplastics or the presence of it at all. One New York study found that bottled water contained twice as many microplastics as the tap water samples. The small size of these plastics make them hard and difficult to detect or avoid them. Other countries that are also seeing the effects of these microplastics in their water system are Lebanon, India, and Uganda. As the pollution levels are so high, places like the ocean, fish, and sea animals, and of course the water system, the human body is obviously going to take in some microplastics because of the drinking of water and the eating of fish and sea animals. Plastic and microplastics take a very long time to deteriorate, which means when animals and sea life take them in, they do not always deteriorate so very quickly. This creates a possibility for us humans to take them in when we eat seafood without being aware of it. Another way for humans to take in microplastics is salt. More than 90% of salts sold across the world contains microplastics, with the highest levels, of course, found in sea salt. Now that we all know where microplastics are found in our environment, we should all see and know how harmful they can be to our environment. Microplastics harm things like sea life. The sea life in the ocean can eat and mistake microplastics for food. Sea life is seen as something so sustainable. There are seafood restaurants everywhere now. But something so sustainable can be destroyed by pollution and by microplastics. Microplastics also harm the water system. The harm in the pollution of the water system and the contamination of the water system is that people drink this without actually knowing what's in their water, which leads to humans living their everyday life and taking in microplastics. The ocean is harmed because of its contamination by little objects that we do not know and cannot always see with our naked eye. And there cannot be like a beach cleanup that can pick up because of the hard to spot pieces of plastic in the ocean. And it's always hard to find something that you can't see. In the ocean, there are two categories of pollution of plastic. Those two categories are macroplastics and microplastics. The biggest factor in categorizing these two and making something a macroplastic or a microplastic is the size. A macroplastic is in contrast of a microplastic. A microplastic is anything under 0.2 inches long, which would mean anything over 0.2 inches long is a macroplastic. Both types of plastic are very dangerous pollutants, but macroplastics are much more visible than microplastics, as microplastics can be invisible to the naked eye. Because of the size of macroplastics, they're usually not digested or taken in by humans, as they are much more obvious to not take them in and identify them as plastic. But as for microplastics, humans take them in while they live their everyday life. And as for the pollution in the water and in our ocean, macroplastics can pollute the water much more visibly than microplastics can. When the water is polluted by macroplastics, things like beach cleanups can help before they become a much bigger problem. But again, for microplastics, it's hard to fight something you can't see. As we all know now, microplastics are so prevalent in today's society. With this, we do need an instrument to identify and quantify microplastics. The most efficient way to identify polymers is something called Raman spectroscopy. This instrument is the most efficient way to characterize the toxicity of polymers and identify their sources, whether it be clothes, bags, bottles, or other types of plastic products. Going back to the C&EN Article and Schwabel's study, Schwabel didn't know whether or not that these microplastics affect human life or not. This instrument will help us determine whether it does or it doesn't. The picture on the left shows the different toxicity levels of the fibers, which are also plastic. The way that this instrument works is that it allows researchers to analyze microscopic pieces of plastic by focusing a laser beam onto a small spot to obtain Raman spectra. Raman spectra is the frequency that this instrument gives us so that we can identify the toxicity of the plastic in the fibers. The light is also scattered with frequency change and produces a wavelength. As the field progresses, we hope that this instrument can help us identify the most dangerous and toxic polymers and plastic today. In conclusion, the fact is that we are still in phase 1 of the field of study. Microplastics are very dangerous right now, and being aware of that is also very important. Macroplastics are the source of microplastics, and the pollution can be reduced by a large amount if we eliminate the macroplastic pollution. And as the field continues to grow, we will find out the long-term effects on humans. These are the sources that I used for research for this presentation. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoyed.